living much more distance lives, and brands are being forced to design remote first products. The easiest way to think about this is think about the hospitality industry, where lots of restaurants have got things like meal kits, or chefs have produced, increasingly producing things like sauces so that they can actually get into people's homes without people being able to, when people can't go to their own restaurants. Then the second one is what we call the donut problem. And this is about the idea that cities are sort of being hollowed out. So there's almost like a hole in the middle of each city, because people aren't traveling in, they're not commuting, they're not traveling to the big stores at the weekend, they're living much, much more local lives. And what this has implications for in terms of the media and retail landscapes. And then the final one we're going to look at is this thing called the metaverse, which is essentially gaming becoming a lot more sociable, and gaming almost sort of merging with social media, I think, in some demographics. And if you think of the world of Ready Player One, that's all about virtual reality, and we're not talking about that yet. But it's the idea that it's where you choose to spend your time. It's where people go because they know you're always there and stuff like that. So it's almost like a social media, really.
Yeah. Cool. Great. So shall we kick things off then with the first trend from FOMO to FOGO?
Yeah. So what I think this is just a fascinating trend, and I think so. I actually, this phrase isn't unique to us. It's one I think I read in the summer of last year, and the idea really is that we're just living much more distance lives. Literally we can't go out. Literally we're meant to be at home. I think we're only allowed one trip outside the home a day for the purposes of exercise. Although, when the weather's as nice as it was at the weekend, I think people are doing far more than that. But it's the idea that we're going to be living more distanced lives, I think, potentially for quite a few years as we sort of adjust to the new situation. But then I think also there are, people who are in lucky position to be able to, work from home, get things delivered to them, have a relatively good salary coming in. I think many of those people will have kind of thought, well, actually, it's quite nice not to feel the social pressure to go out as much as I wanted to. It's, it's kind of cheaper to stay at home, or to, or if you go out, to go out less often, but go out better. So I think we'll sort of continue to see this. And I know, one of the industries I'm really interested in, and I find it a great inspiration when I'm thinking about things like trends, is the hospitality industry. Because with this one, it's been like the canary in the coal mine, in that they were hit really early on, and there was nothing they could do. People, they were ordered to close their doors in most cases. So what they had to pivot to was essentially initially delivery, which is the easiest, but then the idea of meal kits, where you can supply somebody all they need to make a really good quality burger, and you can have all the sauces, and you can put branding on it, and sort of be quite playful with the packaging and the unboxing experience and things like that. And so I think the way those sorts of things are evolving, I think some of them won't really stay, but I think the more high-end ones, the ones more for a special occasion, I think for things like, Mother's Day, which is coming up, but even, in fact, Mother's Day is when we're still under lockdown, but I think when you get to things like next Christmas, when hopefully we won't be in lockdown, people will still have these because they're fantastic gifting things as well. And, it gives you all these little extra bits, these little extra flavors that you can't really achieve at home as easily. So I think that's just an analogy for the way that we'll be much more willing to order things into home, to just sort of say, well, instead of us trying to cook a fantastic meal for such and such a birthday or something, let's order one of these things so we know that most of the work is done, but we also know it's going to be fantastic, and it's also going to be a talking point. And it's also, we talk about, no more FOMO, but actually when you see people's photos of meal kits sometimes on their Instagram, that's an element of FOMO. So I think it's sort of almost like a talking point as well for these future events. So I think a lot of those sorts of things will continue. But then also there have been examples where Amazon has this thing in the States, which is really interesting, where they have this new service called Amazon Explore, which is almost like a mashup of the Airbnb virtual experiences where you can get somebody in Barcelona to show you how to cook something, or somebody in Vienna to take you on a guided tour or something. But because it's Amazon, there's an element of commerce built into some of them as well, and I think that's just fantastic because I could be sitting on my sofa on Saturday morning and do a walking tour of Vienna or Salzburg or something, or I could give it to my parents as an anniversary present or something. And it's the sort of thing that would be that would potentially completely blow people away. So I think we will continue to live in this sort of strange world where obviously a lot of people are chomping at the bit to go out, but I think a lot of people will sort of increasingly be thinking, there were definitely upsides of that time we had to spend indoors. I realized how much stuff there was on Netflix. I'd never realized quite how much I enjoyed just sort of digging into a box set or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a positive thought, isn't it? And I believe the same, where, to take positive things out of what's been a very difficult period the last 12 months. It'd be a shame to think that we may just go back to the way things were. And I absolutely don't believe that will be the case in many aspects of society. One of the things we're talking to clients about, particularly those that are sort of working within sectors that are attached to like lifestyle, going out, etc. There's a bit of an anticipation, I believe, this year, once restrictions are lifted, that people will potentially, within the short term anyway, sort of make up for lost time, and maybe particularly certain elements of perhaps the younger generations and so forth that have an appetite to go out and so forth. Do you think, you mentioned like social media influence there, do you think there might be, a sort of pattern of behavior, for instance, in certain locations which are known well for going out, such as Newcastle, where people may choose to, at least in the short term, to go out? I mean, I think I'd seen on social when the announcements were made last week, there's a number of restaurant owners, for instance, that I'm connected with, and on LinkedIn, they were saying, God, we've taken like hundreds of bookings in the space of a few hours. So it feels like there's a bit of, again, I don't know, particularly with the influences of the economy as well, and the expected downturns, and perhaps people stripping back on non-essential spend and so forth. I don't know whether that will be sustained, but what are your thoughts around this sort of?
I think it's going to go pretty crazy in. Well, I think the three different big sort of threshold points. So it's 12th of April, isn't it, where you can drink outside in bars and stuff. Then it's 17th of May, where you can eat inside in a restaurant, eat and drink inside in a restaurant. And then it's going to be, I think, 21st of June, where basically almost all the restrictions are relieved. So you are going to potentially be able to go to gigs, you're potentially going to be able to go to nightclubs and things like that. And I think they're going to be sort of more and more raucous one after the other, to be quite honest. And I think also there'll be people who think, well, I don't want to, in the same way that I don't particularly enjoy going out on New Year's Eve, I don't really want to go out on that first weekend. I think that's going to be a bit crazy, but a few days after that. I think also, I think there's going to be some really interesting things happening around sort of big celebrations and potentially weddings and things like that. In that, given that we're all working from home now, it's much more easy to work flexibly. So I think weddings potentially, sort of every day of the week, possibly sort of 3 or 4 a day, because people can essentially just book an afternoon off work. Assuming it's close to them, and then go to the wedding and enjoy it and stuff like that, which would have obviously been a lot harder if they were working, if they were actually working from an office or something. So I think that sort of stuff is also going to be really interesting. But I think, and I think, we're just going to have to sort of adjust back to this sort of new world, which is quite similar, but maybe a bit different. I mean, one of the analogies I've heard talked about is it's a bit like punk. When punk came along in sort of 76, 77, it sort of changed the music business forever, and it sort of changed culture forever, because it brought into there was an awful lot of the whole DIY economy with people making their own fanzines, people setting up their own record labels and things. And you can argue that that changed things like fashion, it changed things like music and publishing forever. But then you can also look at bands that were around in the early 80s that essentially could have been around in the 70s as well. So I think there'll be lots of things where you look back at it and you look back at it in 5 years' time and say, okay, this is popular because it was one of the things that came out of COVID. And I think a lot of things will kind of return back to normal, but maybe be a bit more seasonal. So another aspect is we potentially have a crazy summer, but then when it starts to get rainy and cold again, people will say, well, actually, I know how to do the staying in bit. We could just get things delivered. We can get meal kits. We can get all our groceries delivered and things like that. And actually, as soon as I, or say in November, I'm just not going to go out all that much for the whole of November. So I think that there'll be various sorts of things, but I think people have definitely picked up new habits, and hopefully, a lot of people have picked up good ones in terms of exercising more, in terms of drinking and things like that. But then obviously, a lot of people doing the opposite as well.
Yeah. And how do you think brands are going to need to develop? I know in your trends document, in the documentation you put together, you reference sort of brand empathy around a contactless path to purchase as well, being really important considerations and almost necessities, I suppose, for brands moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's the most important thing, really, to basically go to where your consumers are. So if your consumers can't leave the house or can't leave their local area, or physically can't visit your showroom or see you in a shop as easily, then find a way to bring yourself to them. And I think, I mean, a lot of this stuff has simply been accelerated because people were doing things like direct to consumer, obviously for the past few years, and people like Pepsi, people like Nestle have introduced new sites recently, but they won't simply have been planned during the pandemic. They'll have been in the pipeline for long before that. So I think the key thing is really, if people are living more remotely, then how do you get your brand to them physically, but also how do you get your name, your logo, your sort of everything about your brand in front of them. And steal a march on your competitors. I mean, another thing people were talking about a few months ago was certainly with things like hospitality brands, it's kind of like you will go from a situation where no one has any market share to suddenly it's all up for grabs. And then also, so I think it's going to be really fascinating times, but I think people are just going to have to be super agile. And just be ready to twist and turn like crazy.
Which actually leads us quite nicely into, you reference there around brands needing to go to where the consumers are, to the, the donut problem, essentially, because that's all based on, as you referenced, the location element of people's daily lives to their working habits, and potentially, a greater localization of that. Do you like to talk us a little bit through this?
So again, this is one that really came out of me sort of being obsessed with the hospitality industry, because I read this newsletter, I think in about June last year, where somebody coined the phrase the polo mint problem, which is, it's got a hole in the middle of it. And I mentioned that to one of my colleagues in Scandinavia, and he'd never heard of polo mint. So then we decided, when we were doing the trends, to call it the donut problem. Because it was obviously just a much more universal reference. But the idea is the same. There's just this hole where people don't go. And there's a bloke who regularly tweets, I think he must live in somewhere very central, but he regularly tweets, Oxford Street completely empty at 10 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday. And I'm sort of always thinking, well, you should be in Herne Hill, or you should be in Clapham Common or Battersea Park or somewhere, because it's absolutely heaving. And I think we've seen this sort of, people aren't not really through choice are deciding to stay on in their own neighborhoods, but they don't really want to use public transport as much. They don't, and people have just sort of been discovering local things. So I think that will sort of continue to a degree. But then also, when we do go back to working in offices, and that's kind of like the main driver for this, I don't think we're going to be going back 5 days a week, or certainly not from the beginning. So I think if you go, obviously if you go back 3 days a week, then that's 4 days a week when you're essentially potentially living locally. And so I think we'll see much more of that. And I think that's a really interesting sort of thing, because I think a lot of people have been trying to get people to sort of shop more locally and to think about the provenance, think about where the food actually comes from, and that sort of thing. And so, you're getting something close to that as a result of the pandemic, which I think is really interesting. And I think there's a few sort of media implications of this one, in that we've always been, we've always, when we're looking for media moments, we thought, well, millions of people get up in the morning and then spend about 45 minutes traveling somewhere, and they might be reading a newspaper, or they might be listening to the radio, or they might be listening to a podcast or something when they're doing that. So how can we actually reach them at that time? And if you have a disruption of that, then you have to start thinking about, okay, so if my commute is simply walking from my kitchen to my front room, what sort of media moments exist at that point? Or do I have like a little sort of, 15-minute surf before I actually open up my emails? And is that a thing that you can use as well? Or if I'm doing this, do I maybe go for a walk at lunchtime and then listen to a podcast or something? So I think it's really interesting to try to work out what those sort of new media moments are likely to be. And I think location is a really good way to look at that, because it's not only where you live, but also the sorts of places you might visit over the course of a week. So, do you actually have a car? Do you drive a car, or are you simply a pedestrian all week, or and those sorts of things. So so I think all those things are really interesting. And then also there's a big retail implication, which is that for years a lot of the big brands have had this sort of flagship store strategy, where you have this great big flagship store in the city centre that is almost like a museum for the brand, almost, following the idea of the Apple stores, in that it doesn't really matter whether you buy something or not, because you've just experienced the brand for half an hour as you walk around. But obviously, if people aren't traveling into the centre, that becomes less relevant. And I think we may see, potentially luxury brands, instead of being in the luxury quarter of a city, then sort of trying to open, maybe a 6-month or 1 year pop-up shop in an area where where a lot of the customers might have lived. And, as a way, like I said, with the first trend, it was a way of essentially moving to where the audience is.
Yeah. And I mean, that traffic almost, be it footfall or that then aligns directly with the media consumption, it's really going to shake things up. And I presume, the winners are within that are those that are going to be more agile, be able to adapt, perhaps look at the traditional ways that they've always done things, such as, advertising on transport terminals. That might become less relevant if people are not traveling into the city centres as much. And, there's a lot being talked around, like audio, for instance, and, the benefits of that. And you reference in your document, digital out of home, how that might change as well and evolve.
No, definitely. I think, we actually did a trend on digital out of home, I think 2 or 3 years ago, because it was just starting to take off. I think the real trigger for it was that in the UK, digital was suddenly more than 50% of all out of home spend. And obviously the UK is a very advanced market, but it seemed to be a really interesting signal that there was so much money going into it, because digital just gives you so much more flexibility with things like creative message, but it allows you to target, by time of day, you can even change the message depending on who wins a football match or something. But then there's all sorts of other unintended consequences as well. I was reading a thing the end of last week where one of the banks was saying that as a result of people not commuting so much, what they had to do was they just had to increase their investment in. So I didn't even know these things existed, but essentially there are what they call cloud ATMs, where essentially ATM that anybody can use, although I always thought in the UK anybody could use any of them. But essentially to make more commitment to that, because if you're not, if you haven't got a pattern of traveling into work, then it's much harder for you to visit your usual ATM if you have one, if you try to visit the ATM which is from your actual bank. And so therefore you're probably not going to the old ones you used to and things. And I think also it's things like, and this is a bit like of a blurring between the first two trends, but it's, if you can't go to your bank, if you physically don't want to go to your bank because there isn't one within a couple of miles of you, which is my situation, then you have to work out how to do things like, how do I pay in a check? And actually on my banking app, I discovered that I can pay in a check simply by taking a photo of the check, which is like, like magic. It shows up in my account, which is incredible. And that's an example of something that I would simply never have done if I'd been able to travel the 2 or 3 miles to my nearest branch of the bank, or if I'd been able to go to the one which is near work. But actually, I was forced to experiment in that sort of way.
Yeah, and it leads you on to think, well, how do those types of brands that perhaps may have that behaviour traditionally behind them, be it banks or similar, that are typically based in locations, physical locations, how do they need to adapt and almost transform a little bit, where possible, to meet those needs? And that the competition will drive that as well. You'd expect, for instance, with that development you mentioned there, that my wife and I have with our bank account as well, that's almost set the bar of expectation now, that virtually all the other banks now need to catch up and do that if they're not able to offer that already. And there's this evolvement, it feels, that it is significant influence over the city centre, and then how they, very much like shopping centres, have had to and continue to have to evolve in terms of their offering. They're not just retail outlets now, they're sort of destinations of entertainment, whether the city centres need to go in that direction as well. And with more people, with a more agile way of working as well, there's a lot of narrative coming out now around do localized areas or conurbations need to consider or should they consider places where people can go to work? If they're not traveling into the office all the time, but they don't necessarily want to work from home, is there almost a business opportunity there, or a town planning opportunity to say, well, how do we then adapt to offer? Because that certainly in local towns and so forth, based in Northumberland, I can say this with confidence, before the COVID, they were struggling, and many still are in many ways, and continue to do so. But it might actually help that evolvement of saying, well, the local high street might actually be able to adapt if there's greater footfall, because more people are sort of staying in their local areas, and what new services or opportunities may arise on the local high street to meet that need.
That's a whole other conversation, but I think there's I think there's going to be some it's kind of the thing of Build Back Better, isn't it, really, in that there were lots of problems happening with the high street already. And if we now take this as an opportunity to say, okay, you haven't got Debenhams anymore, you haven't got, whatever, what can we use these spaces for? And there's a lot to be said for things like, just essentially allowing people to live in city centres as well, because high streets always used to be a mix of residential and commercial, and then they, became entirely commercial. But, I'm sure there would be, I'm sure a lot of people would love to live, in the sites, in sort of converted sites where Debenhams used to be, or even, sort of a flat above the shop sort of thing, if people were building those sorts of things again. I think that would be a great opportunity. And then the other thing is just all the different leisure opportunities. So things like, virtual reality places. So they were already springing up, before the pandemic, but I can see, some cinemas being turned into things like that, where, instead of you getting 100 people turning up and paying £10 each for 3 hours, what you get is different rooms where, 5 people might turn up and spend £30 each for an hour or something. try to make that into a business instead, and just try to evolve these things, as you say.
Yeah. And so we touched quite a bit there on dwell time and I suppose where people are and how that influences their consumption of media and so forth. And that brings us on nicely to the third trend that we're going to talk about today, the metaverse, which is very much about dwell time, if you like, via gaming, and the fact that it's become a lot more social, and whether that will then influence opportunities moving forward, particularly around commerce and so forth.
I think so, yeah. So I think, I categorically, I'm not a gamer. I really suck at gaming. Even when I was a teenager and I was trying to play video game stuff, I just totally sucked. And so I've never been a gamer, but I've become really interested in it as a cultural force. In terms of, I've read quite a few books around it. I listened to podcasts around it and things like that. It is fascinating what's happening with it, in that it's, as I say, it's becoming much more immersive. It's becoming the sort of place where you would willingly, spend 5 hours doing something, or maybe not 5 hours, but 3 hours doing something. Yeah. But also the idea that it's become much more social. So it's the multiplayer games. It's the one where you go because you'll meet your friends, or you've arranged to meet your friends there. That's a really fascinating sort of thing, because I think when people think about gaming, they sort of used to think about it as, well, it's like something else with a screen, so it's like films. People are into games like they're into films, but it is very different in that, with the film, you sit back and the story unfolds in front of you. With this, it's very much a lean-in thing. You're very much involved with. You're changing how it progresses. So it's a very different thing. But I think what it is sort of almost looking like is it's becoming quite close to social media, in that people recognize your avatar, they recognize you're there, you have a personality, you have a way of playing.
Yes.
And it's almost like a self-expression thing. So, and that's very much similar to how people see Facebook, or how people see Instagram or something. And also when you think about streamers on places like Twitch, again, they're putting across their personality, they're talking while they're doing things. So as with social media, you're endlessly sort of giving status updates. You're talking about how your day has been and that sort of stuff. So I think it's really fascinating to see how these things do develop. And then if you take this idea that gaming is becoming like social media, then you sort of think, well, what does that mean in terms of how brands can fit in? Because there were always issues about people not wanting brands within their games. And I think that was particularly because you might be spending £50 or something for a DVD to play the game. And so if you paid that money, you don't necessarily want to see billboards everywhere. So there were attempts to put ads into gaming a few years ago, and it never really worked. And then also with that, you couldn't really update the games. There was no two-way path. So you had no way of knowing whether somebody had seen the advertising. If somebody had interacted, there was no real way to interact either. So, but now all that has changed. Now that you get a lot more free games, you get a lot more live streaming games where you've got interaction. You can put ads in through things like programmatic channels, but then also you've got the influencers as the Twitch streamers. And again, they've got people who sort of listen to everything they say, and they're their heroes and stuff like that, which is very similar to what you get on Instagram and TikTok and Snapchat, in that you get these sort of public figures who are by definition, they're going to actually have favorite things. They're going to actually have brands that they would naturally endorse. So you can easily see how they would be good spokespeople for brands in certain sort of categories. So I think it's really fascinating, and I'm sort of trying to find ways that I can get more involved with it without actually exposing how bad a gamer I am, and exposing the fact that I don't particularly enjoy spending hours of my life doing things I'm not very good at.
No, I understand. Because by its very nature, you sort of need to immerse yourself within that world to fully understand it and comprehend it. But it's interesting. I mean, I'm not a gamer either, but I'm aware of the commercial aspect that's come in. You mentioned there around the costs associated and I know this is a growing, being a parent and hearing stories of parents with older children, and for certain games, in order to get the weapon, you need to pay to win the game. You need to pay this sort of fee to get there, and I suppose it's a natural evolvement of that commerciality that we might see, and that sort of working with that sort of not to assume that all gamers are young, but that young adults and younger, but that's often when we've seen social platforms, for instance, like Snapchat, and more recently TikTok, that do upweight on that younger audience. Often that adoption that younger audience can be really accelerated because of the nature of working with them, and the way that the audience, without means to generalize, can embrace sort of new things, new creative ideas. So be an interesting space to see how it evolves over the coming year or so.
Yeah, I think there's just so much scope for creativity within there, but then also in the same way that, so Richard Osman is a really interesting example. So I've heard a few interviews with him. He's always really entertaining. He basically, his story is he basically grew up just watching TV 10 hours a day. And that was kind of what he did. He watched TV and he became a total TV geek. So then he managed to get to Cambridge University, got a good degree, and then he wanted to work for a TV company. But now he's, but he totally, when he was trying to think up new formats or when he was trying to think up ideas, because he had all these years of exposing himself to so much TV, he thought in that way naturally. And then last Christmas, he had the best-selling book in the UK over the course of the year. And he's moved from one thing to another, but he kind of comes from being, a TV watcher, and that's what taught him about storytelling and stuff. And so the people who are teenagers now who are spending all this time playing video games, I think the sort of things they come up with and the sorts of other categories they move into are going to be absolutely fascinating. And I think it's really going to, push culture forward. And I mean, the sort of the temptation is, as you get older, to assume that all the new stuff is rubbish. But actually, I think if you sort of think, well, what if that wasn't the case? What if, the new films are genuinely better than the old films, the new books are genuinely better than the old books, and music is better than the old music? And I think, I think it's really intriguing to imagine how somebody who's grown up watching video games is going to, when they come to maybe make a TV show, how they're going to do that, or when they come to, in fact, we've kind of got, in a way, we kind of got an idea of that, because, again, another British TV person, Charlie Brooker, again, grew up playing video games, on a Spectrum and things like that. And now he's, writing TV dramas and writing films and show running and all the rest of it. So I think it's going to be really fascinating to see the sort of creativity that people who've grown up playing video games and not really watching TV, how, what they go on to do next.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, I think that brings us to a close. Dan, thanks so much for your time.
It was really enjoyable.
Yeah, well, obviously we'll share the replay link, and if there's any further questions that come in, or if people watch this back and want to find out more, I've got any burning questions they want to ask. You're on Twitter, aren't you? You're on LinkedIn.
I'm easily Googled.
Yes, so you can get in touch with you directly, and it'd be great to maybe catch up in a few months' time, and when we get to the middle of the year, and we can see how these trends are evolving, and what will be a very changeable year.
To do a follow up, looking at what happened to go, whether we did have this sort of mad crazy summer, what's happened to our cities, what sort of how they're actually changing, how things are progressing. That'd be brilliant.
Right. Well, we'll get that booked in. Brilliant.
Amazing.
All right.
Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Dan. All right. Take care. We'll speak soon.
Bye bye.